Alderwoman Flowers. Alderman Boyd. Yes, please. Alderwoman Davis. Alderman Kotar.
Here.
Alderman Ogilvy.
Here.
Alderwoman Boyd.
Here.
Alderman Bosley.
Here.
Alderman Oldenburg.
Here.
Chairman Roddy.
Present.
8 present, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Last meeting, I think I announced we would start each meeting with the opportunity for the public. This is an idea I used to see at the school board, I think, where they would provide a couple minutes at the beginning of the meeting. I have an unusual thing happen to me. Perhaps some of you have the same thing. I have people sending me tweets, giving me advice about what I should do down here, but I thought, are perhaps critiquing what we're doing down here, but never showing up to offer any advice in person, and so I thought I would provide this opportunity so that if anybody felt so inclined, they could go ahead. So if there is anyone in the audience, we can provide a couple minutes right now. We'll be, if I can remember, trying to start each meeting to give everybody 2 minutes or so. Is there anyone who cares to address the committee on any of the topics of the day? Okay, if there is none, we'll go ahead with our scheduled agenda, which is on the resolution to try to create some guidelines on incentives. Some of you may have seen an article that was in the Riverfront Times regarding our last meeting. I had the distinct honor of being referred to by the vernacular term for the male sex organ that rhymes with tick in the headline, and I perhaps appreciate the sentiment, but I do appreciate what it's trying to accomplish, or what I think it will help us to accomplish, and that is we are going through a laborious process of trying to reach consensus down here, and the idea is to take these issues that some people have when they come before the Board of Aldermen off the front page. We're interested in getting less attention for what we're doing down here, and I think we can do that in a way that represents the public's interest and provides a clear guidance forward for developers who are interested in our city. And as I've stated before, our goal, we feel that we need to provide clear guidance to developers so that when they decide that they want to invest in our city, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars doing pre-development work. They spend a year or two of their personal or their firm's efforts at getting down here. When they get before the board, they need a level of certainty. It was kind of amusing in the article in the Riverfront Times that suddenly they were shocked to discover that if a business went through all that effort and did all those things that and then get something from the city, that it might be painful for the business. And that is the whole idea of this, is that we have people, we have had people, and we're not trying to be judgmental, that have gone through the entire process of securing economic incentives from the city, and then before the Board of Aldermen find their projects criticized and jeopardized in some cases. So the intent is to go ahead and provide a clear path forward for them and review and diminish the internal divisions among ourselves. When we have those types of situations, it not only creates uncertainty for the developer, but it also undermines the confidence of the public in what we're doing down here, and that is not a constructive thing. We can certainly do things better. That's why we're here, but none of these projects we're all going to agree on, but if we have certain guidelines, hopefully we can go ahead and say, well, it gets me 90% there, and I'm comfortable enough supporting these things, you know, across the board. So I think what we're trying to do is the appropriate balance between aldermanic courtesy and so that the alderman whose ward these projects are in can still remain the sponsor of it, but with an element of certainty that people from, you know, outside the ward are not necessarily derailing something that that person may have worked on for a long time. So with that thing, we're going to be making an omelet down here. That was one broken egg. We have to break eggs to make omelets, but I want to make it very clear to everybody, and I hope I enjoy the support of the committee, that if we adopt these guidelines, that we plan on kind of enforcing them in a way that people who want to have access to them will abide by the guidelines and be respectful of what's going on in other people's wards. So that's the intent of that, and you know, I'm going to be using assuming that we can reach some consensus, get these adopted by the board, I'm going to be doing everything I can to go ahead and make sure that they're appropriately enforced. The other thing, well, let me just leave it at that. So what I want to do today, I'm going to have a couple more pass outs. I've been trying to limit the amount of paper that we give, but I know that if you're like I am, you go to committee meetings and you end up, I might steal one more of those if you don't send it down this way.
For the book.
We're trying to minimize the amount of paper, but if you're like I am, you go to a committee meeting and then you leave everything there, and the next time you come back, you don't have anything. What I passed out before you is the executive summary of the study that was done on incentives. I don't want to go ahead and print the whole thing out, but the page 7 is kind of the recommendations that they had. I'd like to kind of take a second and make sure that we're all kind of remembering when we have these discussions kind of where we are in this whole process. I'm going to pass out something else here, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. This is just a little reporting sheet that we're working on. And then I have just the summary pages of the survey that we had. I think that's supposed to be here. Sherry was going to bring that for me. Oh, here it is. This is the summary sheet of the listening sessions that we had, and it gives a kind of bullet point by bullet, recommendation by recommendation accounting of the responses we received. So, what I thought we would do is at our last session, if you open to page 5 of the feedback summary of this report here, and I know that we have somewhat of our committee members have other committees and other obligations, so we have kind of a floating participation down here. So I'll try to recap. What we did was we went through and discussed these and felt that most of the guidelines, I think it was 1 through 6, were fairly succinct and would be the type of guidelines that would not be led to much misrepresentation or misinterpretation. We had asked for, and you'll see in the feedback report, guidelines 1 through 6 at least had very high approval ratings. And we began having dissent with guideline number 7 through 11. So I thought what we would do today was to begin to drill down to some of those, and at some point try to have a bit of a kind of open dialogue session. I've asked our executive director, oh, I thought Otis was going to be here as well today. Anyway, well, the mayor's executive assistant, I'm sorry, Linda, I do not know your official title. I am so bad at titles.
Deputy Mayor for Development.
Deputy Mayor for Development is with us. Jonathan Faring is with us. We'll try to make this a little bit of an informal process. What we had asked for from Jonathan was to walk through, which example was it? We were talking about dividing the TIF proceeds to see which would go into supporting the TIF notes and which would be kept with the city, and we asked for a concrete example so that the committee could clearly understand that, and that was, I guess, guidelines 6 and 7 before we actually go into the next one. Excuse me for just a second, I forgot something.
But I get confused because I'm like, well, they say they're reducing the tip and the
No, I wasn't gonna start without you.
Go ahead and proceed, Alderman.
We needed a moment to just kind of peruse these anyway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because we hadn't seen them before. And so the first document you want to talk about is the explanation of guidelines 6, 7, and 8. Hi, Mr. Farron. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You're going to provide us with an explanation of the guidelines for 6, 7, and 8, and walk us
Yeah.
through this document.
Correct. So I was asked to sort of come up with an example of what it would look like to do this pass back, or possibly a better word for it would be pass through in the guideline. And I have some comments at the end of this presentation that I think explains that a little bit better. But in essence, what I did was this first, I created, it's the same project, but I looked at 3 different scenarios. The first, which is this first table here, is sort of your basic scenario. It's what we're doing today, where you've got a new development, and the site of the project where it's being built has a base assessed value, property value of $500,000, base sales tax of $25,000, and base earnings and payroll tax of $15,000. So the way the TIF statute is written, what we do is anything that's being generated at the site obviously does not get captured by the TIF. It gets included in the base, so that money will continue to flow through to the taxing bodies as it currently is today. So all the numbers just show, like, this is just the annual assessed value of the property year by year. The capturable is literally just that number minus the $500,000 base value, and then that's, you take that capturable amount, multiply by the tax rate, that's your property tax increment. Same way with the sales tax on the right half, sort of the middle set of columns. You've got your estimated tax per year. The capturable amount is that first number minus the $25,000 a year base, and then sum that up, and you get that how much, basically, you sum it up, you take the discount, or not discount, the debt service coverage of 1.25, so you divide that sum by, well, I guess first you take the net present value at 7%, then you divide by 1.25, that's how much could go, how much the TIF could support. So when we're sizing the TIF, that's how we would determine what the size of the TIF would be, and the same thing for the earnings tax. So you've got about $240,000, 15 minus the 15,000 base, so you've got that leftover $225,000 or so summed up to the end. And so you can see what you've got is the size of this TIF value would be just over $18 million. This is what this project could theoretically support. So that's what we're doing today, and we're taking into account substitution effect in our analysis, obviously, whenever we're trying to evaluate what the net financial benefit is going to be to the city. But it's not exactly the same thing as just saying that whatever is substitution effect is off limits to the TIF district. So we were just talking about this in the TIF commission. An example of this might be, the example that was brought up was Ballpark Village Phase 2. So in Ballpark Village Phase 2, there's obviously a number of components to it. There's an office and a hotel, and there's going to be some restaurants and retail and residential space. If you look at each of those components individually, there's a very high substitution rate on the restaurants. About 85% was projected. Overall, what we did, though, was in our analysis, what we said was that the net revenue, after you take all the revenues and subtract off all the substitution effect and all the incentives, the net revenue was, X amount per year. And when you compared that to what we say we need to have in order to be financially sustainable, it was still a viable project. So we said we recommend the project. What these guidelines would potentially do is they would say, well, the individual components that have high substitution effect rates, we're going to cut that out of being capturable. And the main effect of that essentially is going to be not necessarily financial to the city, because let's say you were doing a project like Phase 1, which was almost exclusively restaurant and had very high substitution effect rates and didn't generate a whole lot of other taxes. What the analysis would do today is the analysis would say this does not score well, and so therefore you're going to have to reduce the amount of the incentive, which essentially is the same thing. What this does now is it addresses sort of these very diverse projects, and it says, well, if we're going to the reason we're going to reduce, the capture or the subsidy on those highly substituted pieces is because we're doing it for the benefit of the companies that are competing with that piece. So for the other restaurants, for example. With that explanation, what I've done is I've looked at scenario 2. So in my mind, there's two different kinds of sort of substitution, I guess you could talk about. One would be the example where you've got an existing company that is on a different property altogether and moves to a property that's under development and being incentivized. So the example I did here was assuming that one of the office tenants at this new development is already in the city with a $10 million payroll. So that $10 million payroll would be $150,000 a year in earnings and payroll tax. So we would add that to the base. So instead of $15,000, it would be $165,000. And so whenever you take that almost $40,000 and you subtract off the base, you're left with just under 75 instead of just under 225. The net effect of that is it reduces the value that the TIF can support by $1,352,000. So that would be sort of an example, a mathematical example of how this sort of pass-through thing would work, where we would say we're just not going to count this as being capturable by the TIF, and so it's going to reduce the TIF amount. Again, I think the proper term for this is restricting pass-through. I think of pass-back as being more like a clawback, where the money would be paid to the developer, and then the developer would have to give it back at some point in time. What we're doing is we're taking it out at the front end, so it's just not going to go to the developer in the first place. The exception to that would be, before I go on to scenario 3, the exception to that would be the project where a developer is going to build an office building, let's say, and they don't know who their tenants are going to be yet. Let's say they think that there's only going to be a 10% substitution effect rate, but it turns out that they actually just relocate one or a number of companies, and so the substitution effect rate ends up being way higher. Okay? So in that case, that's where we'd need to talk about a pass back, where we'd say, okay, look, you said you were going to bring in new companies, you really didn't. You kept a bunch of existing companies, and so therefore the city lost a bunch of revenue that we weren't anticipating up front. We presently don't have a mechanism in place right now because we don't require that kind of reporting from the developers. So we'd have to put a number of things in place before we could implement a clawback like that. But I think that's another issue that needs to be addressed. So with that said, I want to go to scenario 3, and this is more I would say what I call more pure substitution effect, I guess. This is where you're talking about the loss of revenue from the competitors. So this is like more the retailer and the restaurant example. So in this case, so I have scenario 2, so I'm building off of the previous scenario, plus the projected retail sales exceeds the estimates of unmet demand by $3 million per year, representing an approximate 30% substitution effect. So, so basically $3 million of the sales per year would result in an additional $93,000 basically. So that would say $93,000 of that sales, because the sales tax rate that the city collects is 3.1% for TIF purposes. So, so $93,000 would be added to that existing $25,000, and it would basically be said it's off limits. It's not capturable by the TIF. So that would reduce the capturable amount from $227,000 to $134,000 in the first year. When you pass that on through, the difference between scenario 2 and scenario 3, it would reduce the TIF by a further almost $840,000 over the life of the TIF. So again, this is what we would end up doing. The way that this works sort of mathematically is we calculate it on the front end and we reduce the TIF size by that amount rather than, you know, paying it through and then getting it back. And then the next information just gives just some of my commentary on how I would define the difference between a pass back and a pass through, and some of the reasons why to consider it and what the drawbacks are of doing them, which we can talk about if you guys would like to, but I'll pause for now.
For the us number nerds on the committee will provide a chance for people to drill in a little bit, make sure they understand that for those of you who eyes start rolling over when they see this stuff, the net effect of both of these things will be a pretty significant reduction in the amount of revenue that that supports a project. In other words, it represents a pretty significant amount of revenue coming back to the city prior to servicing any TIF debt, which is, I think, a more financially appropriate way to account for sales increment as a result of the substitution effect. For the folks who want to understand this a little better, informally, why don't we? Anybody on the committee want to ask any questions on this side over here? Just raise your hand if you do. Alderman, did you have something?
On these examples?
Yes. I'm sorry, I was reading a look in your face. I wasn't sure if you had wanted to ask a question or not.
I mean, I was just thinking about, I recall a case where we, in 2011, with the Cheshire restaurant, where we did something like this, where we set, at the time of the development, they were talking about relocating an existing restaurant that was already in St. Louis. And so we set essentially the floor revenue at the level of retail sales at that restaurant that was already here, and the increment above that could be what would be, it wasn't a TIF, but could be captured. But I mean, reading Jonathan's comments, that was a case where we had a base we could work from, similar to where if you're relocating an office tenant, you have a base you can work from, but the substitution effect is impossible to know, I guess, if you don't know who the tenant is in advance, so.
Yeah, you make an educated guess, basically.
Right. Applying this in all cases, I think, would be challenging.
Mr. Chairman, this is Otis. I apologize for being late, but we had TIF Commission, which we were talking about a similar subject, and the TIF commissioners had a few questions that ran over, so I sent my representative. But to what the Alderman was saying, many of these will be on a case-by-case basis. We're setting a standard, but we have the ability, and what I'd like to leave with the committee is that we will need to look at each of these as they come to us. But that will be, I call it, the ground rules will be out there, and people will have to make a case of why they don't fit the scenarios that we have here.
Alderman from 62.
John, what's the calculus behind the substitution effect? Because it can be kind of a nebulous concept in
Sure.
some cases. And I would also say that we maybe should consider giving value to jobs retained that would otherwise leave the city. Now they may be moving just, from St. Louis City Block A to St. Louis City Block B, but if they didn't have that site in mind, they could move, to Clayton or elsewhere. So if you wouldn't mind just touching on that.
Yeah, so if you're talking about let's start with the retained company. With the retained company in my analysis, what I do now is I actually don't count those as substitution loss. I actually count it as base revenue.
Okay.
For the purpose of the, so when I'm reporting the new revenue, you're seeing the new revenue subtracting off that amount, but you're not seeing that as lost revenue, if you
I
will.
understand.
Right?
Okay.
So I'm doing that now today, and I think part of the reason for the guideline, I'll just throw this in there, I think part of the reason for the guideline, talking about Alderman Ogilvy's example, is that that example isn't necessarily always what's done today. I think the idea of this guideline is basically to make that Cheshire Inn example sort of like the norm rather than the exception. So with regard to this, the other part of your question, when it comes to like retail sales and restaurant sales, essentially what I do is I look at the very simplest level, I look at what the existing demand is for whatever the thing is. So maybe it's existing demand for a certain type of retail. And I look at what the existing supply is. So just very, very simple example, if the existing demand is for $4 million worth of sales of a certain type of retail, and the existing supply is $1 million, right? And the new, so 4 and 1, so there's $3 million gap, right? And the new company that's going to come in is projecting to have $4 million a year in sales, okay? So you've got $3 million in gap versus $4 million in sales. That means 75% is new, so 1 minus 75%, 25% substitution effect.
I'm with you. Okay.
And you have access to retail sales databases that are that?
Yeah, down to the type of retail, yeah, so sporting goods, whatever. Where it gets more difficult is restaurants can be more difficult because the way that the data works is it looks at when it measures the demand, it measures the demand for residents within the city. So it doesn't necessarily tell you what the demand is for people that don't live in the city that are coming in to shop or whatever. So right now, for instance, the city has a large surplus of restaurant supply. And that is because there are more sales, restaurant sales, than there are demand sales from city residents, because there are a lot of non-city residents that are, eating at our
If we were
restaurants.
talking about international economics, we would be talking about, we would be a next exporter of that service or
Correct.
whatever.
Right. We're a net exporter of restaurant sales. That's correct.
However, we are a net importer of most retail sales as our residents.
Correct. So it gets a little bit more complicated then. I have to sort of build a model and this is where it really gets, where it's a lot more difficult to say, 100% what is the actual substitution effect rate, because I essentially have to build a model that says where are these customers coming from, how many of them are city residents, how many of them are county or, Illinois residents, and then what's the likelihood that they're currently already eating in the city or not. Right, and so then that can vary by the project. So like, for instance, a project that is much more diverse, whether it's Ballpark Village Phase 2 or City Foundry, is going to actually have a lower substitution effect than it would be if it was just a standalone restaurant, because those projects are bringing in new people for other reasons, particularly City Foundry was. So there's a lot of people that are going to come in to shop at City Foundry that otherwise wouldn't have even been in the city. And so while they're there, they're going to buy, they're going to eat food or whatever. And so that's going to reduce the substitution effect. Now, exactly by how much, it's an educated guess,
I wanted to ask you a question, because one of the things that I hear a lot about our incentive process is, well, just don't give them anything. Well, any consideration for anything. Well, at the end of the day, that's not smart business. That's the first thing. And one of the things we're trying to do is to encourage people to invest into the city of St. Louis. So when you look at a particular area, I was wondering if we could create something, say for instance, and some market studies do this, within a 3 to 5 mile area, there's X number of residents and we look at the data that tells us about income, age, and all of that, and then we subtract that out of the retail industry that is there, whether it's entertainment or whatever. So say, for instance, like Grand Center. So we know we sell 2 million plus tickets, and that's not counting the small venues, that's the larger venues. And so we know that there's, within that 5 mile area, there are not 2 million residents. And maybe we could give some kind of X factor to a project that is going into those areas.
Right. Yeah, that could be done, I think.
In your convention center area as well. But that still doesn't guarantee a restaurant is going to survive. And that's the other part that a lot of people don't understand. And I was driving by Charlie Gito's, and I thought about that. I was like, it's been 99 restaurants around this place have come and gone. They had good food, good decor, all of that. But he has survived them all. So you can't be guaranteed about any of that. And that's another part of reality that has to come in to the decisions that are made. And people can't just have this cookie cutter thought process of how you do this and what the outcomes may be.
But your example of in Grand Center is something that we did have some consideration for when we talked about Ballpark Village, because of the 3 million people that actually attend Cardinal games. If you look at just the demographics of what is around the stadium, absent the attendees to the events, you get a different outcome.
Right, that's true. It makes a difference. Okay.
Are there any other questions about these guidelines? Okay. At the risk of speaking for other people, I would sense that certainly anytime you're going to go ahead and make assumptions about substitution effect, it's not going to be as succinct as I think the previous guidelines are. But I think it's clear that if the way they would calculate this, even if they made a low estimate of a substitution effect, it would still diminish the amount of revenue that was going towards the developer. I think we can all concur to that. And then the question is are we comfortable as a group that regarding 6 and 7, that we can go ahead and live with that uncertainty of what those substitution rates might be, or do they want to go ahead and try to button that down further?
Well, the other part to this too, and I would defer to my colleague from the 16th Ward that has more direct financial understanding of these projects. I know when I've worked on pre-development parts of projects in the past, that how we package the project too depends on risk factors from the various entities that have investment there. It's not just the developer. And so how do we consider that in making these decisions as well?
Can you repeat part of that? I'm
Okay,
sorry.
so say for instance you have a project that has 2 banks that are taking risk. You also have some SBA loan money there. You may have the private investor has X amount of dollars in it. Because when you talk about developers, people assume developers have money, and that's not true. Mm-hmm. Developers have to go out and raise money. Mm-hmm. They don't have money. So, and so say for instance that part of the process is there, and we have to look at the risk factors involved in this project. And the demands coming from the various entities that are providing the funds. So we have to balance all this and have an understanding of the expectations of success.
Right.
And so it's not as simple as people want it to be. It
Right.
really isn't. And I don't know how we get to that.
Yeah, and is that where financing assumptions, I think on TIF, did you say 1.25 of a debt service coverage that you're assuming? So those are commercially.
Eats and 1.1 on the pilots.
And 1 point, yeah. So those are commercially reasonable kind of underwriting metrics that I think most commercial lenders would use in a real estate
Okay.
project. But I think you're also asking the larger question of the assumption of what the financing or the financier's sort of loan-to-cost and loan-to-value assumptions are in totality of a development
Thank you.
project, right? So if it's a $20 million project, right, a typical bank is probably going to want 60% to the loan-to-cost would be sort of a very conservative. Maybe they go to 65%. So that does mean, in fact, that the money has to come, the balance of the money, right? The other 35% needs to come from somewhere else. So this is where these tools are very powerful and needed to fill that gap.
gives
Where if
some
a bank's only
assurance
going to
to
load you,
those who are lending.
you got it. If a bank's only going to loan you 65% of the total project cost as a matter of risk and degree because of the project's location, the market study, all sorts of other factors, that's where these incentives come critical, absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Alderman, the assumption that we always go with is that the capital stack is pretty well set, that the bankers are all willing to take the risk, but for this gap that we are all considering. And so that's where the analysis that John does comes into, so we've evolved to doing very detailed analysis where we were by the seat of our pants. It sounds good, it looks good, so let's do it. But we do have the numbers now to be able to relate to. And the debt coverage and all of those things are things that are in the model. So the one thing I can compliment John on is that it's very detailed. The model is very robust. And I think anybody who has checked it, and everybody, to include Team TIF, everybody has looked at it and said, it works. The assumptions are the thing that people are concerned about. What are the assumptions that we're putting into it, right? And so that's where I think the discussion is.
Let's go through the committee members and try to get a, why don't you give me a blank one? Don't need that for the records. Alderman Kenny, regarding guideline number 6 and 7, what's your Alderman Kennedy, he was here.
Oh, okay.
Alderwoman Flowers had asked to be excused, as well as Alderman Boyd. Alderwoman Davis, what's your sense on the guidelines 6 and 7? What we're trying to, and again, to refresh your memory, we're trying to get guidelines that we feel are succinct enough that if we have a project over here, we won't spend all of our time arguing about. So in essence, we're, at this juncture, we would be kind of taking a leap of faith that there would be some substitution effect, and we can't mandate that at this level. So are you comfortable enough leaving that kind of decision to SLDC, or how would you like to tighten that up some?
At this moment, I'm comfortable with leaving it because one of the things I've always appreciated is that we do have the bureaucratic side of this, and it takes the political legislative folks out of those kind of decisions. So when it gets to us, unless there is something extremely glaring that is outside of your calculations, there would be no reason for us to question. So I'm okay with it at the moment. I think a lot of what has come forth, as well as just don't give any incentives, it's a lot of assumed wrong that has taken place, which is not necessarily true. And when I looked at this sheet that you gave us, This looks like the sheets we used in the beginning, when we first started doing this, so I appreciate it. I can move with it.
Alderman Kotar, your thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alderman Oldenburg brought this up, and Jonathan touched on it briefly, but, you know, one of my big concerns, and it, I think, does have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, is that retention piece. You know, as the Alderman for downtown, looking at companies that are constantly looking to move to newer Class A space outside of the city limits in Clayton, you know, I want to make sure if they are making a decision to stay in the city and they want to relocate to either new construction or rehab an existing building, that we're not making that impossible to do. And I think if we're factoring in that retention of jobs downtown, I think that's important, and I think Jonathan knows that, and we dealt with this on Ballpark Village as well. But, you know, we got to do whatever we can to keep our existing employers and make sure we're creating attractive new Class A space to eventually try to get some folks to come back within the city limits from outside.
Just from a standpoint of mechanics or process, retention, if you're at one location and you're going to move to another, doing spec office building, it's really hard to predict. But if you're working with a specific company that is at location A to location B, I think that's a lot easier to do.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we might think about doing is just from the standpoint of accounting and record keeping, because that's going to be a big piece of this puzzle, is we might take a look at using some sort of other incentives that we can record keep and specifically devote to job retention. I don't know, you know, if we have some other, you know, tools that we might end up.
Well, generally, our job retention is in combination with the state, but we also use the other tools that we have, that you all have approved, like Chapter 100, and that has, for personal property and for real estate, has been the primary tool that has been the key for many employers staying in the city.
So we kind of have.
I mean, that one goes directly to the employer for the most part. And so that has been real helpful, as opposed to just a TIF, which is primarily for the developer.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But Jonathan, when we're talking about job retention, that, what I heard correctly is from algebraically, that's just adding more to these base values then, if you're saying this is a job retention project. And we may layer more incentives on top of that, right? And that's where maybe substitution effect could so you could have a job retention model that adds more to the baselines, but then if we're layering more incentive in there, then there could also be a substitution effect, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're really talking about, what the crux of the issue is here is the difference between what we're doing today is if there's a company that we know is moving from site A to site B, we are counting the existing earnings tax that company is paying in the base. And so when I report what the net new revenue to the city is, and when I sort of, you know, put that into the scorecard or whatever, it is based on both the base and the new revenue. But if the incentive was such, like let's say for example that you've got a company that is moving their jobs over and they're not creating any new jobs, but they're asking for an incentive, you're going to end up with a net negative revenue that's going to be reflected in the report.
Got it.
Right, and so therefore you would be able to say, okay, something's wrong here. But what the difference is that here we're saying, should we just simply count it as base and then it still needs to pass our scorecard, or should we just say that's off the table, you can't capture that?
I see.
Right. And then I think the other thing which I do think is important is when you're not talking necessarily about, and it is still tricky, when you're talking about the developer who doesn't know who their tenant is, right? And they think they're going to have somebody new, but then they end up getting somebody existing, and then your analysis ends up being, you know, you can't predict, right? So you could end up having a significantly, like it could be approved based on X, then it ends up being far more negative financially to the city than we predicted because, you know, the analysis changes. And so that's the question is, do we need a clawback situation
And
put into
isn't,
place?
isn't that the point you were underscoring between a pass-through and a pass-back in
Right.
the scenario? that
That's
you just-
correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderman, I just want to go ahead, Alderman Kotar, I want to go ahead and, you made a comment, but are you comfortable with, I'm trying to move off of these two bullet points so that we.
Yeah, no,
progress
I'm
through the-
comfortable.
Okay. Alderman Ogilvy.
Thank you. So, yes, although 6 and 7 are different. So, 6, we're talking about sales and earnings taxes, and it's probably worth pointing out that there's, I think, a typo within the resolution, because then it says property taxes under number 6 when it should say sales and earnings taxes. So I think we should be doing this analysis and restraining the incentive or including sales and earnings tax in the base, especially restaurant and bar sales, I think, in particular. And then I think we need to make a case-by-case judgment on earnings taxes, which Jonathan just was talking about. If we're just moving the same people at the same jobs from site A to site B, we can only do so much of that incentivizing before you have a negative cash flow to the city, and you don't want to incentivize in a way that gives you a negative cash flow. So that's 6. So yes, on a case-by-case basis, we ought to be doing this. 7, property taxes, I don't know how we talk about the substitution effect in property taxes. So 7 seems like a different animal or a different beast. So I would,
Okay, thank you.
I'd keep 6 on a case-by-case basis,
I
but
actually
I don't
prepared
think that
some
I'd have
myself.
7 in there.
Here's what I did. I'm sorry, Alderman. I think I heard you say you'd like to see that. Did you, on 6, and that you wanted to have, did you want to tighten that up in any way, or are you comfortable giving them a year and then seeing what they did at the end of the year, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm comfortable with the language to be determined, because I interpret that to be determined as to be determined on a project-by-project basis. Not that we're going to apply one standard now to every single project that comes through when we don't know the details, but to look at including sales and earnings taxes in sort of the base revenue analysis for every project, we should do that. That's fine. It's just, that's 6. 7, property taxes, to me, it's a little bit less clear what the substitution effect is on property taxes.
I think that's a valid point. Do you have any comments on that, Jonathan?
Honestly, I was involved in putting the guidelines together. I don't honestly remember how that ended up in the guidelines. I think it was probably just one of those things where we said if we're doing sales and earnings, we need to do property, because generally I don't know how to measure a substitution effect on property taxes.
It wasn't so much substitution effect as if we were going to, on a case-by-case basis, determine the amount of the, in most cases we look at 100%, right? So we were going to determine whether or not we were going to roll that back. So it was a reduction more than a substitution effect on the property tax. So instead of the 100% abatement or whatever, that we would then be looking more at 75% or some number less than the total.
Okay, so it wouldn't be so much substitute. So we should probably think about in the final, I get in here and I'm kind of in my own head so much that I have trouble kind of giving us a forethought, kind of where we're wanting to go. My plan was was initially to get this done before we went down over the summer. I'm gone on Friday. I really wanted to take some time and have this discussion that we're doing today. I think after this discussion, we're going to have to incorporate the comments that are being made today in verbiage, that's reflected in the resolution. I don't think we all want to sit around and do that, with the resolution in front of us, I think the comments and are going to require us to reflect a bit on that. Then the idea is over the summer break that we would then circulate that. Then when we come back, I and our executive director have repeatedly attempted to schedule with the alderman from the 25th Ward, who is also chairman of the Neighborhood Development Committee. It is not his fault. I mean, it's just our schedules have not aligned properly, but we owe him the courtesy of doing this, of reviewing this with him. And, if he chooses, we might very well want to make this presentation to his committee. This is all about building consensus and collaboration, and we need to take our time to do that. And then, assuming that we get that, then we would do this as soon as we come back as possible. So that's kind of where I'm going with that.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the fact that you do want to take time and include and explain as much as possible. One of the things we are known well for sometimes is rushing, and then we get to the floor for a vote, and we rehash the whole thing as though it never took place in committee.
Well,
Appreciate
my hope is that we spend a great deal of time on this now, and we get agreement. And I am not asking everybody to agree with this resolution. This is all a discussion. But after we do pass the resolution, I'm expecting people on the floor to abide by it. Now, if they
Have an understanding.
if they have a moral objection to any of these things, that's fine. It's just don't ask us to use them in your ward then. Alderman, are you comfortable now with the response with item number 7? In concept, we obviously have to reword it in the resolution.
Yeah, so if we're thinking about it that way, if we're thinking about just, we're not going to, I don't know if it's a case-by-case basis or you want to apply a consistent standard to it, that we're not going to pledge 100% of the pilots to project debt. I mean, that would, picking a number, even if it's 90%, would actually, I think, mute a lot of the criticism of tax abatement, tax increment financing, because we could also argue that, it's not a tax freeze. They are paying more after the improvements are made.
So one of the things we have to be careful of is that we don't have a negative cash flow to any of the taxing districts. So that's why it'll be part of the discussion and negotiations that we have. And so.
Do you want to? I mean, is Otis? Is the intent to pick a number that's less than 100 as the maximum, or is it to think about what that should be on a case-by-case basis?
I'm thrilled to hear that we will delay and have further discussions because it is important. The idea was that we were relating, I think it's 9 and 10 where we were looking at the MVA. But in these other areas, even in 6, we are looking at where we are looking at incentivizing and whether or not the area is such that we should be on a case-by-case look at whether we are incentivizing or not. And so,
I just want to add a thought.
okay, he wants to add a thought. Well, let Linda add first.
I think you asked an excellent question, and I don't really think it's necessarily a light switch. Is it 100, is it 90, is it 80? I think one of the things, and I had one conversation with a prospective developer, and I said, do you think you could live with 90? And what it brought up was a conversation that maybe it's 100% projections on the TIF revenues for the first 5 years, but maybe it steps down to 95, it steps down to 90 after 10 years. And so I think, maybe what 7 could say is that the TIF projections can be adjusted or should be adjusted on a case-by-case basis, to provide for some pass-through to the taxing districts as possible. And, the developer thought that if they could get, some of the early years, maybe they could step down after that. So just a thought.
Yeah, and I guess my other question is, I mean, that makes perfect sense for tax increment financing. I think it's easier to apply a more uniform standard on tax abatement at less than 100%, because then it's not, you know, part of the revenue equation that's underwriting the debt that they have. I think we can probably not abate things at 100% and have, I think, very little impact on development in the stronger areas. So, I mean, I'd be for that, certainly.
One suggestion I'd like to make on that is that we could do a balancing act, because I think tax abatement and having it be, you know, not 100% would be very thoughtful. Maybe we need to add an extra year at the end, you know, so that there's cash flow to the taxing districts, but there's also this, you know, essentially the same net benefit or close to the same benefit, and that way it's, you know, kind of a win-win. So maybe instead of 7 years, it's 8 years, but 15% goes through to the taxing districts immediately. It's just a thought. I think those are the kinds of things that, you know, they're not, like I said, it's not an on-off switch, it's more like a rheostat.
So one thing that I, just a thought that I was, wanted to add was, you know, there's some of these projects where the city might have a positive cash flow, but the school district might have a slightly negative cash flow. Not that they're, that negative cash flow is actually the loss of growth in what might happen, you know, just the natural growth and appreciation of property values or whatever. So one thing that you could potentially do is you could just maybe reword it to say that we're going to put in a place where, you know, the city and school district both have to have either 0 or positive, you know, growth levels, or maybe what you just say is, we're going to say that the city's or the school district's revenues, for instance, we're gonna build in the base as they're gonna grow at a 3% annual rate or whatever, and then, you know, if the project produces sales tax, because the school district does get sales tax, and it offsets that, then that's fine. They can still get maybe 100%, but if they don't, you know, let's say it's a pure residential project or something, we could just say that the tax abatement will be scaled back in accordance to make sure that that number is positive. You know, it could be something like that. And it wouldn't be a severe tax. You wouldn't be cutting it back by a lot. Generally, you're probably talking about 90% or something. Yeah.
And one last thought for you is that while everybody thinks that the central corridor is in fact done, and that it is does not need any incentive, at least that's the way it's portrayed. It is not, and so it is less than dense and what we really need it to be, and so I think one component of what we've been saying is that we would always say no to tax abatement in the central corridor, or we would reduce that number automatically. There are some projects that will occur in the central corridor where we will need to be able to provide a significant incentive to make it happen. And part of that is building the density and providing for the jobs that are associated with it. So I caution against an absolute, and why I keep saying on a case by case, but there has to be some framework for people to have some certainty of what they might expect coming in. Otherwise, they have to make a case for anything other than what we would have. Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Alderman?
I want to be careful when we talk about guarantees, because we've gone through periods where we didn't have a high rate of developments going on with the city, and some of them had struggled to be finished and or be very successful. And so let's think about that as we continue to have this conversation about giving those guarantees, because we could end up in trouble, and we might not want to go down that road, giving guarantees on something like that. But the other thing I wanted to say very quickly is, as we continue to have this conversation, I think it's really important that this becomes kind of like the catalyst as we go into an overall land use planning process, because there's parts of this city that is really going to require high incentives in order to get some development done.
Right.
And so we don't need to preclude that. We need to end all incentives. If anything, I could see doing 25 to 40 years incentives on some areas of our city in order to get some growth going there. So I want to make sure we include that as we go forward.
I was just going to say that. Thank you.
And I think that if you look at 9 and 10, where we say, and particularly for the MVA areas G, H, and I, we anticipate maximum incentives in those areas for sure.
Okay.
Could I ask a question, please?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We were going in order, and I jumped, and she
That's
butted in
okay.
front of you, so.
You did a good jump. You good.
Yes, actually, you're next on the, I'm sorry,
That's
Alderman
okay,
Ogilvy,
you
are
fine.
you? I'm done, yeah. You're done, okay. Alderwoman Boyd.
My question is there any, and what's the 2 to 3 year plan?
Is that what now?
Is there any plan, and do you have a 2 to 3 year plan? And I think Alderman Marlene Davis in regards to talking about other areas of the city. And so is there any, and do you have a 2 to 3 year plan for the North Corridor?
Okay, so there have been what I call neighborhood plans that have been ongoing, but our goal was to do a citywide plan. And the citywide plan would be, you know, from the 4 North to the southernmost tip of the city, east and west. And so it would include a very thorough public interaction process. And so what the delay, we actually have the RFP written. What the delay is actually having the funds available to be able to pay the consultant. And so we're prepared to be maybe a third, we being SLDC is prepared to be a third of the overall, maybe a fourth of the overall cost. But we think that the overall cost is probably going to be in the $2 million range. And
That's
so
all?
it could be higher. I'm just saying that at least.
$1 billion 15 years ago.
So that's
one
for
more.
the North Quarter?
That's
Or
for
that's for the
the city.
citywide?
That's for the city.
And so,
And the key component of it is I call them the listening or stakeholder sessions that will be citywide in each of the neighborhoods. And to be able to incorporate that in the overall city plan. And so at this point, though, neighborhoods are working with our planning department on an individual basis to develop neighborhood level plans.
so could I ask who is doing that?
Should check with Don Rowe at
Don Rowe.
city planning. And while he's under-resourced, at some point, you rise to the top.
We're going to have some more discussion on this as block grant comes in. We're going to take a look at this. I shouldn't say for sure, because we need to build consensus around this, but we're going to have some, at least discussions about the commercial district program and perhaps what we might be able to do to that, to do some things on an interim basis. Alderwoman, do you have any other questions? No. Okay. Alderman Bosley, do you have any questions or comments on guideline number 6 or 7?
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Chairman. Don't have any questions, but as far as comments, just wanted to say I can appreciate the wealth of knowledge in the room. Definitely know that our incentives need to be reformed, so it's nice to be a part of the conversation, and I love to learn, so I have learned and going to continue to learn. So I know we're going to continue to have discussions on it, so as time goes on, I'm sure I will have questions, but at this point, I can just appreciate, everybody's wealth of knowledge in there, so thank you.
Thank you, Alderman. Alderman from the 16th Ward, questions or comments on guidelines 6 and 7?
I think 6 is good. We went through that. 7, to restate it, to make sure I'm tracking properly, and then I think I'm okay with it, is that we're not sure how substitution effect applies to property tax, but that we'll be evaluating on a case-by-case basis of something less than 100% or something that maybe gets to the same net benefit, but does accrete some value to the city over the term of it. Is that what I heard, I think?
Yes.
Okay, then, Mr. Chairman, I am good with 6 and 7. Thank you.
Okay. And again, I'm trying to simplify things and give us a little bit of direction on where we're going. My thought was, we have two board bills before us on community benefit agreements. I think those are a topic in and of its own. My hope would be is that we would begin discussions on those when we come back in session. I don't want to even project when we'll get done with those, but rather than go ahead and we can certainly leave this in here if it's the will of the committee, but I think if we do, it needs to be with the understanding that it might be superseded by subsequent legislation. My other alternative would be to just delete guideline 11 or perhaps put a notation in it that we are, sure, Alderman.
Very quickly, one of the things that we've learned is that this is another process that can't be jump-started and ended quickly. So there'll be a lot of conversations, most especially public input around the community benefit agreements, and we probably are looking at about the same time frame, maybe the first of the year, before we get to a point of having something that we could bring to a committee and talk about a vote. So we're probably on the same timelines in a way of speaking. There's still a lot that needs to be discussed and a lot of
When you
input.
say we, you're talking about President Reed's board bill?
I'm talking
Okay.
about President Reed's board bill, and there was also conversation about Alderwoman Green's board bill from the community, and they had concerns about why couldn't some process come together so that they're having one conversation from the community about community benefit agreements. And so we may even get to that point, I don't know. But I do know that we are in a preliminary stage and that there needs to be a lot more discussion and input from the public for sure.
Okay, so with regard to this then, one of the things regarding community benefit agreements, we are, we're sharpening our knife here on the amount of revenue that's left over. And, I mean, if you sharpen this knife so there's no fat left in the deal, there's not a whole lot left over for community benefit agreements. And so, what I hate to do is to put something in writing that says we're going to do something, and then we, 6 months from now, begin changing it. Right. And I'm even hesitant when we start talking about, putting dollar amount figures and stuff like that without a lot of thought. I don't know, and I'm bouncing around here. We went from earlier up to this one here, but I thought this would be a relatively easy one to kind of deal with one way or the other. Is there any preference on guideline number 11, leaving it in there? Should we take it out, make connotation that it's in our, I think we need to address it in the resolution. If we take it out, we need to have some sort of comment towards why we are taking it out. Right. Alderwoman Davis, what's your preference?
I think because it has its own path, you might want to take it out.
Okay, with an explanation.
With an explanation.
Replace with explanation,
Right.
okay.
And I want to ask our colleague from the 16th Ward, he had an opportunity to hear a lot of conversation from the public, because what I learned, and it was great for me, is that the public almost has a better understanding of what the definition of community benefit agreement is. It's not necessarily dollars. The project itself could be a community benefit, and that would end that as far as that neighborhood is concerned. So say, for instance, if there was no grocery store, and there's being a grocery store built in their neighborhood, that's a benefit to the community, and they would not necessarily probably ask for anything else. So the definition, I think, is fluid from what I heard last night, and we need to really continue to work on that. So when you hear some people saying, the people who really live in the neighborhoods, and that's who we heard from, it's a little bit different. I got the same thing, because I have 12 neighborhood meetings I have to go to in my ward, and I got the same thing as I've been talking about this for like the last 6 months. So we have a long way to go.
So your preference to be, is to replace with explanation. Alderman Kotar, do you have a preference?
I mean, as written. I mean, we're given pretty wide latitude here. Maybe we take, if we were to leave it in, do we take the dollar amount out? Because, I mean, that's sort of
That's our option.
arbitrary right now. I mean, you know, there's a couple of CBA proposals floating around the board. I imagine it's going to be a while before either's adopted. I think it's a worthwhile goal to eventually have some sort of CBAs tied to large projects. But right now, I don't think we can sit here and say that $50 million is the number. Maybe it's $100 million. I don't know. But having something generic about, you know, just to keep us on track in developing some sort of CBA process, I think is worthwhile. But I don't know why we've got 50 million.
Pull the dollar amount, but leave encouraged is vague enough that,
Yeah.
well, then if we do that, if we pull a dollar amount, I still believe that we need to have an explanation as to, you know, I think we need to provide more guidance as to, you know, what we anticipate doing in the future, you know, that, you know.
Yeah. I don't know what that is.
Well, that the, you know, you know, there's a CBA bill before the Board of Aldermen, and that we would be, you know, hopeful that some resolution in that
Yeah.
legislation could be forthcoming prior to, one of the things we're going to have to discuss today is the timing and the sequencing of this resolution. So, you know, I think we could tie that into that, would be my thought.
Yeah, that would work.
Okay, Alderman Ogilvy, comments on item number 11?
I don't think within the framework of this resolution, we're going to be able to be specific enough about what we want to do with community benefit agreements. So it doesn't bother me if it's not in the resolution.
Alderwoman Boyd?
I think we need to do it and have, refer it over and with a note with it.
An explanation. Alderman Bosley?
Yeah, I just agree with taking the dollar amount out. Definitely think the conversation needs to be had, and it needs to be there to open up the doors for us to have more conversation about it.
Okay, so, I'm sorry, did you say take the dollar?
Yeah, just take the dollar amount out. Yeah,
And then,
I think the agreement
provide
definitely needs to
additional
still be
guidance
there.
then as well.
Right.
Okay, Alderman Ogilvy, are you comfortable with that? I said
Yeah, I
Ogilvy,
know
I'm
what you
sorry, too many O's here. Oldenburg.
I am. I think that we should memorialize in the conversation of incentive guidelines, community benefits agreements should be memorialized and referred to that there's a board bill. So I would like to leave it in and be vague in the way we just discussed.
Okay. So we can take that off. Now we're down to three policy guidelines. And the one is the SID and TDD. And I thought, Jonathan, I'm not really sure what you are encouraged. City will encourage SIDs and TIDs that, TDDs that reduce the TIF and tax abatement requests, but only approve. City will encourage that reduce the TIF, but only approve CID projects that include public improvements. Are you saying that you're going to encourage, what,
So I'm pretty sure Brian Robinson wrote this, and the idea, I think, was in part, which is, I have an example on the last page of the handout that we were going through before, which is, it's very simple. It's just showing, you know, if you need $10 million in TIF and you added a SID and a TDD and it could generate $2 million, and you just reduce the TIF by $2 million and you know, replace it with the SID and TDD. I mean, that's essentially the gist of what that sentence is, partial sentence is before the semicolon. The part after that, I think, is probably getting more at, there was actually a lot of comments in the public sessions, in the written comments, that people in the public were wanting SIDS and TDDs to be reserved more for things that are, maybe the way to say it would be more strategic community-wide developments, or, you know, like basically for infrastructure improvements for a larger area rather than for a single site kind of thing.
Let me go back and give you the genesis for why I asked Brian to write something on this. This is because our TIF commissioners at one point was discouraging any SIDS and TIDs and maybe increasing the TIF amount. And so this specific one was to focus more on having the SID and TID, reducing the amount of the TIF, because the TIF is the thing that goes on the comptroller's book. And as the one that is at issue is the amount of the TIF. And so that was really why we had the thought here. The things that are that's sort of in italics, we can eliminate and just essentially say that we encourage use of the SID and TID as an alternative.
Okay, I feel better now.
Okay.
So the idea is to reduce the italics part. I'm sorry, I don't see the italics.
I might have a different version of it.
All right, well, yeah.
After the semicolon, maybe.
Yeah, it may be what yours may not have italics. So it's after the semicolon. So just stop at as alternatives and period. And eliminate from but to the end of the sentence.
Okay.
Makes me feel better.
Okay, so let me repeat back to you what I think you're saying. So there was resistance by the comptroller to reduce the amount of TIF, which...
Not the comptroller, no. We were trying to ensure that we had the minimum size TIF to support the comptroller's, goal of less TIF, essentially.
Okay, so basically, the goal would be to get money returned to the appropriate taxing districts at an earlier point because the TIF is smaller.
It's smaller.
And to do that, you're suggesting that they increase the tax rate on them, on the project.
That was what...
In some way, shape, or form.
That was our,
and
yes.
The difference would be, the total debt would be the same. It's just that the debt supported by general fund, or the underlying taxing districts would be less. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Chairman?
I think I understood it. What threw me off was this after the colon, because it seemed like those were opposite.
Okay. So,
Don't we already do this? I mean, don't we primarily use SIDS and TIDs, single-site SIDS and TIDs to lower?
We do. My point was that for those where we were getting use of SIDs and TIDs with TIFs, the TIF commission was suggesting that they not be there.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I would prefer to use those, as the guideline suggests, to lower the TIF amount, use a SID and a TID, which is a tax on the property.
So that's essentially what I'm suggesting, is that just go to the word alternative, put a period there, and
Are you saying put a period and then delete?
and delete.
And delete all this.
and
Okay.
and
So this is where getting consensus can be kind of interesting, because we have, a fellow regulatory board, or I'm not really sure what you would call the TIF commission, approval board, kind of giving us guidance in one direction, and I think there is a number of
Well, after this morning, I think we're all on the same page, okay? So we briefed this same, we talked about this same issue this morning to the TIF commissioners, and everybody is in agreement.
Okay, so they're in agreement in deleting that, but the general public
Well,
actually...
I didn't mention them deleting this, but that use of SIDs and TIDs and then reducing the amount of the TIF, that concept, they agreed on.
Okay, but the general public is what we had comments from the public saying that they would like to see that done on a more kind of a shared resource basis where, so that would be, I guess, negating some of the, or not ignoring them, but we would be.
Yeah, and based on my conversations with a lot of people in the public, I think the idea is that because SID and TDD were basically meant to be created for, the name kind of implied community improvement district. I think the idea was that it was supposed to be something larger to help the general community. And if you do a bunch of single site ones, basically you dilute the ability to use those for, like if you were going to try and do a large corridor plan, So I'm personally torn. I know that I don't want to, I'm personally torn on it because I do see the benefit in sort of using these things more strategically, if you will. And maybe this is just interim until we get a city plan, and maybe this piece specifically will change, and we're going to say down the road, like, we need to use these things more, like, strategically to, like, turn around, the Gravois corridor, or Chippewa corridor, or Dr. MLK corridor, or something like that, because I really think that tool can be used for those things.
Okay. You're right, this is part of the interim part of it. And so, for instance, if you look at the way different cities are organized, in Kansas City, they have 30 area-wide community improvement districts and TIF districts that are overlaid. And so they do what he has just described. I think, though, that before we are able to do that, we really need to go through that planning process and understand where we are. So for right now, we're taking what we're doing, we are modifying it a bit, and just trying to eliminate some of the bad pieces, if you will, until we get to the.
So your suggestion then would be that we emphasize the first portion of that statement, but perhaps not delete the last portion, but again acknowledge that the use of those tools might be something we consider after the completion of the plan. Then would that be? So what I'm trying to do is provide us the flexibility that to grow, but not, slam the door on folks who have opinions. Because I tend to agree with Jonathan. We have done community improvement districts or special business districts throughout the 17th Ward, and I think they've been, I think they can be an incredibly powerful centrifugal force, kind of bringing all elements of the community together to focus on what the most important issue is for those neighborhoods. And I would hate to think that we preclude those.
And we don't with this.
That's just my personal opinion.
Yep, we still encourage, the real goal would be to have a area-wide TIF district, but we run counter to where the budget officer and the comptroller wants to be on those, because they are sort of not supportive of that. But where we have area-wise, like in Lafayette Square, and there are a couple of other places that we have in the city, they work. So I agree, but we also have a development that is ongoing that essentially has been using the individual ones. I'm going short of saying let's not do that. I'm saying let's, for the sake of some of the larger projects that we have, that we just use that tool until we get the area-wide plan done.
One last question before we run it through the committee, other committee members. If we were going to go ahead and do that and use the CID or TDD to decrease the TIF note, would the combined TIF note plus the CID/TDD note be still subject to the overall percentage of development cost? That you're saying that if they do that, they can. We don't have it in here, but historically, what is it, a 15% of project cost guideline?
It isn't now, but it probably could.
I mean, one of the things in my experience, since I was on the other side just until very recently, is that if you take a project, you have X number of sources, you have X number of uses. Everybody knows from development, and if you say, I want you to do more improvements in the neighborhood because you're using a TDD or SID, you're adding to the uses, the sources. The other thing is that when lenders look at a project and you add a 2% sales tax on top of it, and when lessees, prospective tenants, look at a place where they have to fight against another retail that doesn't have that 2%, they're going to pay you less per square foot. So it really is a formula where every piece you push on pushes somewhere else in the formula. So asking a developer to self-tax, to put the 2% on each sale, reduces how much they get from traditional lending, which means the gap goes up, which is hopefully filled by the TIF and the TID, the TIF and the TID and the SID, but and the TIF can go down, but it also changes who pays for the improvements. So instead of the taxing districts paying for it, you're putting it on the customers. It's, everything pushes. And so, with the objective of trying to get more money to go through the taxing districts, the users of the project fund a larger percentage of the underwriting for the costs. So, and I think both of those things are very valid, but one of the things that came through the Greitens Commission was, and I think it got taken out of the final recommendation, was a cap on sales taxes. And so this tool may not be available for us as a city, as a community, or anywhere in the state to help have the customers of a project help pay for that project. So there are a lot of other issues that are out there. But one of the things I want to go back to something you said, Alderwoman, about all of a sudden, the tools aren't there for other geographic areas. At the state level, we're having the exact same thing. One of the proposals is to eliminate historic tax credits for single-family homes now that we're getting to a new area that really could use it. So I think we need to think about what we're communicating outside too, but I know that's not the subject for today, but would love your input on that.
Oh, but the 15% was always kind of the target as far as the total amount. So if you're doing this, are you going to go ahead and say, oh, it's okay to go above 15% then?
Well, to me, a TDD or a SID is really the developer saying, I'm willing to reduce how much I get.
So what you're saying is that
The
it could go
15%.
over 15% then?
Because the TDD, I believe the TDD and the SID should not be included in the 15%.
It is not. We currently do not count it we generally look at it, the SID and TID above the 15%. And so some of our, I won't say adversaries, but people who look at it will say that the public subsidy then is 15 plus 2, so.
Well, see, then, what I'm saying though is if, if you're using it on top of the 15%, then you're really not using it to reduce the 15%.
Right, but it has, though, in practice, allowed, generally, we have those coming in below that. So I see your point, but I do think, though, that if we go back and look at all of the TIFs that we have, we probably have some that are probably above that, but most of them are, and we came up with that 15% rule arbitrarily. Okay. There's no place out there that tells you that 15% is it, and we did this about 15 years ago, and now it's become gospel, and so.
Yeah, I mean, in my own view, there are, well, we'll talk about it a little bit, but I think there's reasons in some cases to go above 15%, and I think there's reasons that for other projects we ought to cap it below below it, because I think we need to, yeah, but I think a lot of that is what our goals, if it's job creation, our revenue generation for the city, as example, sales tax revenue. I mean, we might want to go above that, and when we start using percentages of total development costs, and much of the development costs are incentives through other programs like brownfields or historic tax credits or something, rather than use 15% of the total project, I would rather use, you know, a higher percent of the incremental value. But I'm going to talk about that a little later on, because we're not going to be able to deal with everything in this resolution, but I think we need to send a couple notes over to them as things that we want to kind of keep an eye on and begin measuring as we move forward. And, you know, I'm getting off of these particular points here. I'm taking too much time because it's 11 now, and we have really been spending a lot of time in this committee this summer, and I want to make sure we get out of here at a reasonable time. So I want to go ahead and get some of the other people to talk here. Alderwoman Davis, do you have any questions or comments about guideline number 8?
I believe we need to be cautious. One of the things that I can look past is people don't understand the financing mechanisms, and that's what we're dealing with every day on each project. And so each project will be different. There's no way we can just set a guideline, and that's what we do with every financing project that comes through the city. That is not possible. It is not realistic. And so I want to look at how we can put something together that makes sense, but also explains that this is not just something you just say just because. And it's getting to that point, you know, and I saw people with light bulbs coming on last night when we were talking about these very topics and explaining financing mechanisms and all those things and the leverage that comes from different entities. So we have got to educate the public. A few people running around just saying, don't do it, and it's not fair. Well, yes, it is. It depends on the project, it depends on that community, and it depends on how we evaluate the needs that are coming with the project. So I'm just really worried that, you know, if you set some hard standard for it, and that's just going to be it, we're going to jeopardize a lot of projects that could come our way and make it difficult for people to come and do and invest in our city. Just be cautious.
Alderman Kotar.
Nothing further.
Alderman Ogilvy.
Don't have any other comments.
Alderwoman Boyd.
I just wanted to say, I want to thank our chair for being thorough and being cautious in regards to what we're getting ready to do, because as Alderwoman Davis says, that we'll get hit harder if we do it hastily. So I'm glad that we are putting it on hold and starting to go through the process and letting the community have the input, because they're the one that's going to benefit in the long run. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Alderwoman. Alderman Bosley, comments on, we're on,
Odenberg. I know we are.
8.
8, thank you. No, I don't have any questions, though. Thank you.
Alderman Oldenburg.
So where are we? Are we
Well, the
strike
idea, yeah,
after
I think we're going to, what I was going to suggest is that we emphasize the first portion as an immediate concern, but be respectful of the public by saying, you know, by alluding to the second one, and then I think we can stay silent on the 15%, you know, for, you know, a great worthy project, and it, you know, we're missing, you know, that last 2 or 3%, then, you know, then they can go ahead and throw a sit or tid on, and
That works for
you're
me.
okay?
Yep, I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Now we're down to the last, I think the last two, and where I thought we would go after this is I had a couple general points after these last two, but this may take us a little more time. When we're done with these, these last two, just to kind of give everybody a sense of where we're going here, our deputy mayor has a couple issues that have come up that she'd like to address specifically. I think that other people, I don't think we're going to be able to deal with them in here, but I want to make sure that we address any wage or employment issues or acknowledge those, because historically, certain size projects, we did things with employment and perhaps living wage, or we want to go ahead and at least, we are not going to undermine any of the existing, well, here, let me finish these two, and then we'll come back and talk these collateral items here. Number 9 and 10, the reason I wanted to hold off on these till close to the end is I think these are the most ambiguous, and it's, there's two issues that have come up. One was the, some complaints about using the market value analysis for it being obsolete. Another one was that it was an inappropriate measure, and there was a suggestion of another source to use as our benchmarking or calibrating device. And then the second issue is the term exceptional projects, and that is, I think, overly vague and will result in a bloodletting down here. When somebody comes in with a project, they say it's exceptional, and then we can have a real discussion about what's exceptional. So I was hoping that we could begin some discussion of that. I guess save all the hardest problems for last. The easiest of those would be commenting on the market value analysis. I think you had come up with some ideas on that, and I can't recall what the reference was with that came up at the meeting that they wanted.
The alternative was census, and I believe that the census is really every 10 years. That while there are some updates, it is not the panacea that I think was being proposed. So the market value analysis, a lot of work had gone into, a lot of variables were considered, and I think the date of the market value analysis that we have been using now is 2014, I believe. Right. And so the idea is that there's a need and a requirement for it to be updated, and it will be updated more frequently than the census. But because of the number of variables that are included in the market value analysis, I thought that it would take in consideration the kinds of things that I think that we're concerned about, but also I think even the people who are bad-mouthing us would be concerned about as well. And so that was, and we have that data to the degree that we need to be able to do it. I'm okay going either way, but I think the market value analysis would be the way, and I'm not sure if Linda has a preferred alternative, because we didn't talk about this one, but.
Well, thoughts on market value analysis. To me, again, going back to like what I was talking about before, it may be something where, we could pass through cash flow to the taxing districts early on in the early years and possibly ask people, if we could, instead of giving them X number of years of tax abatement, maybe add a year or two on, but pass through cash flow to the taxing districts in the interim. But I had a very interesting conversation with somebody who was, buying a new home. Right now, our assessed valuations and our market values don't equal the cost of construction. And so builders are looking at, if I'm building a $200,000 home, they're asking for tax abatement essentially to subsidize the loss in appraised value that happens the second you buy. And so someone was saying, well, if I bought this home, I'd be upside down the next day. I buy a $200,000 home, and the next day it's worth $150,000. And I said, but you're getting 10 years of tax abatement, and you really need to look at the tax abatement as underwriting the differential between the cost of the home and what what your bank is going to say your value is. And you're essentially recovering the differential in your 10 years of tax abatement, or whatever you're getting, 8 years of tax abatement over a period of time. And so every time you push on a formula, like I said before, it pushes out somewhere else. But to me, tax abatement in the single family and in the smaller developments really is underwriting the differential between cost and market value, because we have, I mean, it's a blessing. We have, good housing at low prices. The difficulty is, the banks look at it and say, we have low value to costs. And so how to get something underwritten with your bank, you tell them, I've got tax abatement for 10 years, and they'll loan you more money. They're loaning you that differential in the cost. Is what it's part of what they're doing. So to me, I think going back to the market value analysis, I think it's a good measure, but I also think we need to think about, does that, I love the idea of passing through money to the taxing districts early on, so they don't have to wait 10 years, 15 years for money, but I think we may need to think about, even with market value analysis, do we need a longer period of time in order to compensate for that differential between value and cost?
Well, the two issues with market value analysis, I think we want to talk about definition of what an exceptional project is, but the first thing I think is with regard to market value analysis, to paraphrase what I think you all are saying is you'd like to still use that as our calibrating device. And in discussions offline you and I had was addressing the second concern was the stale data, and you felt that we would be able to have resources available to update that on a triannual basis. Is that correct? Or
That would be our goal, and so that was when you and I were chatting, was to check with Don Rowe on the cost for an update, and so that would still, again, that would be a cost. Now, going to the other side, the census is free, and they do it, on a periodic basis, and so I think I think the goal here was just to have a metric that we could relate to and use as a measurement tool. Right now, all of our economic development incentives are related to MVA. We do it for tax abatement. We do it when we are talking about bonds. So all of our analysts, when they go before the boards now, all relate to the MVA. We would obviously need to.
Anybody else in the real world will tell you
Chairman,
that too.
Could I ask a question?
Sure,
On-
Alderman from the 7th.
And on this, so I remember there was some serious criticism leveled against MVA at our public meetings. So do you guys, and one of it was about the public availability. So is your MVA data currently published somewhere?
Yes, it's online and it's interactive.
Okay.
You can go to a neighborhood and to a census.
And
to a parcel
so
block.
it's readily available.
readily
And when was it
available.
when was the last MVA update?
4 years.
14
14.
versus, do we have any idea? I know they do sort of census updates periodically. When was the last census
Census is
update?
done through the American Community Survey. They do it usually on a 12 to 18-month lag.
Okay. And MVA.
I think the,
Could you guys just comment, I mean, why, besides the fact that you already use it, MVA, why do you prefer it and want to continue using it over census data?
so here's what I think. I think that I think there's two reasons that the public, members of the public criticize MVA use. One is the age of the data, which can be fixed with cost. And I think the other is that while it's true that they can go online and they can look and see, type in an address and it'll tell you what MVA district it is, I think it's difficult to know what makes something an A versus a B versus a C.
So they can't
think
see the data?
They can't see the, right.
Okay, it
So,
supports that
yeah,
determination.
so the benefit is this: the MVA metric and framework is based off of something that was developed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it's a federal level metric. If we were to come up with something on our own, we would use census data, but we would still have to come up with something we all agree upon is like, this is the level for A, this is the level for B, this is the level for C.
Okay.
So it makes more sense to me to use MVA, but what we could do is A, we need to update it more, and B, we probably need to figure out a way to make it so that the public can see what the data is, like, that makes the
Yeah,
difference.
so the data that supports this address or this area getting an A allocation, can we publish that? So if people, I mean, is that possible?
I don't know the answer because I'd have to ask Don Rowe, but, yeah.
Let me say this. I think the data is there, and I just remember when it was deployed, you could drill down as, what the problem that we have is the public, I won't say the public is lazy. It is that the people that when we, that it's easier to have an alternative.
Yeah.
Right now, everything that we do, particularly, and almost everything that we use is using community development block grant. And HUD requires that.
And so we're following HUD methodology right now and
Yeah.
using their metrics? I mean,
Well, that's
creating
gonna
our
tie
own
block
sounds,
grant and everything else. I mean,
Right.
they're going to be given this
It's
guidance.
the
on
norm in the
yeah.
financing industry
Yeah.
as well.
okay. Well, I appreciate you guys clearing that up. I didn't really completely understand the controversy behind MVA.
They're like, you're right, there are like 10 or so different metrics that make it up. It's a blended, and it's a shorthand.
Yeah.
But some areas may have more problems with X or Y metric out of the A.
Right, and this also just gets back to consistency, right? So, I mean, whether it's census data or MVA, I mean, we gotta make sure the data is publicly available. So if you are considering a project, you can go online and look this up and, run your own numbers and come up with your own, your sources and uses and what you think you need before, you come pay a visit to SLDC. So whatever we do, I just wanna make sure that I would prefer to not make up our own system. I mean, if MVA is what's used elsewhere, we should stick with that and just update it.
Okay, so before I run through each of these points with all the aldermen, I'm going to go ahead and make a recommendation on this, and then I appreciate the comment, but I want to make sure that we try to reach consensus, so I'll run these two through all of the aldermen at once when we're done, but to move on to the next topic relative to these 2 points, my recommendation at this point is going to be that we will stay with the MVA for this interim period, with the understanding that beyond the interim period, we have concerns about it being updated on a relatively frequent basis then. Is that, and if somebody disagrees with that approach, we'll give them an opportunity in a minute. Let's talk about the next thing then, which is you've created some guidelines that the TIF is going to be 10% of total development cost in some areas, and then, but the caveat is the exceptional project. So how do we define exceptional projects?
Well, when we were going through it, we were thinking of projects that generated a significant number of jobs or eliminated a huge blight. And so the example we had was, well, obviously the obvious example one is NGA, lots of jobs, retention. The other one was the foundry and on the blight part of it. So I had jobs and blight, elimination of blight. Where we have, something has been sitting for an extraordinary length of time, or it is providing an opportunity for retention of tax revenue, or,
Well, let me kind of play devil's advocate with you, and again, this is, what my concern would be. On interim guideline number 10, and I'm going to pick on the alderman from the 24th thing, because actually I think his is more defensible than an example in my ward. If I were using an example in my ward, I would say the 35-story building on Kings Highway. I think that's, in my opinion, an exceptional project, and it would not be, there is no way that they would be able to finance that with 5 years and 75%. In Alderman Ogilvy's ward, we just approved the TIF down here for a project that I think I looked, after we discussed it last week, Alderman, I looked out on the MVA map, and I think that is C where that was located at.
Could be C, it's either C or D, yeah, I don't remember.
I think it was, I think some of the neighborhood was D and some of it was C. I think that's an extraordinary project for that neighborhood. I think, a project like that, even in the West End, should not get as much assistance as that project got, but I don't think a project in the West End would be able to, a project like that in the West End would be able to get financed with 5 years and 75%. That's, kind of my sense that a building with retail on the first floor with quality building materials, structured or underground parking, my fear is we come down with a project like that, which in the West End is not as, should not get as much subsidy as was provided for the project in the 24th Ward, but it should probably get more than the 5 years and the 75% in, as outlined in this guideline. I think the alderwoman from the 15th is working on a project now. I haven't looked at that area, but that very well may end up being outside this, that I would think would be a C or higher category that we're on Morganford down there, isn't it? Does anyone know?
It probably is today. I think back when MVA was done, it was lower.
Oh, was it?
I think that's
Okay.
part of the criticism about MVA, is it hasn't caught up to a lot of the improvements.
But, irregardless of that, if, I don't think that project could be, I don't think 5-year, a 6-story building with 5 years of tax abatement and 75%. I mean, Banker, do you think that, there'd be any buyers over in the?
I think it would be tough.
I mean, if people want to say no to those kinds of building, I think Forest Park Southeast currently is a D. I think if it was revised, it would probably, parts of it would be B and parts of it would be C. But that would stop any building like that happening on Manchester.
I think that, this is just my personal thoughts, I haven't run this by Otis, but I think part of the challenge here is that you lump A through C together as one category and so on and so forth. I think that there is a distinct difference between an A and a B and a C, so I think that's probably part of what we need to address. But I think also something that the model is that I do when I evaluate projects is already based on, but we're improving it. It's based on the amount of revenue that a project generates relative to what we see typically in that area. And so I think that you could, as far as defining the exceptional, I think that especially once we get our sort of next iteration of the model up and going, which is going to be much more specific, like down to the block level basically instead of at the zip code level, I think that it would be a lot easier to say, well, if you think about it, the percentage depends on what the size of the pie is, right? So like if you've got a project that is generating just like massive amounts of revenue relative to what you'd expect for the area, it would make sense to give more than a set percentage because it's, you could still give a higher percentage away and you're still getting enough revenue the city needs to be financially sustainable. Are you guys following me on that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So an exceptional project would be one that just puts off way more revenue than what we would expect. To me, that's where I would think you would go because it's mathematical and you can measure it, and it's less subjective.
I think there's some soft things. I kind of prepared a slide, I'll take up the whole meeting, but I had kind of prepared a slideshow so that we could actually begin, having a more in-depth conversation. I'm going to spare everybody that pain. I think we do need, there's some soft factors in this, and one of the things that we used throughout much of my ward when we considered exceptional was the quality of the urban design of the project and the quality of the architecture of the project and whether or not it contributed to density. One of our goals was to try to create a more car optional environment that might be a result of increased density. I'm not sure how these guidelines, which would, what I'm talking about is things that would be
I think
consistent
all
with
the three
smart
that you
growth.
just outlined, because we are currently using the urban design and the architecture in our analysis already. And then I think the other thing is maybe we add the new product So, so if we have something that is a new, new build, a new construction project in an area, that maybe that is treated differently. And the number, remember, we came up with this number 75. That number can be adjusted up. But the 5 came because, universally in almost every one of our neighborhoods, we have gone to no tax abatement and potentially around the Central Corridor, Soulard, Lafayette Square, except for some projects that have been sitting for a long time. So what I call exceptional, there has been multiple attempts to develop that particular parcel. It has been sitting, and it is a blight on the neighborhood. It is going to bring density. It is going to bring jobs. Those are the things that I'm looking at.
What about if we, when I had discussed the Dogtown project with the alderman from the 24th, I think the idea of doing scattered site, low-density residential development is like a no-brainer. I mean, we haven't used, tax abatement for single-family homes in my portion of the West End for a number of years. Yeah. We have recently reduced, the length of times in Forest Park Southeast down to 5. So
Yeah, so that's my point. We have moved in many of the neighborhoods down to 5.
But my point is that would be for, so you have I think it's very important for us when we do this stuff to be as succinct as possible, because, we're going to be opening ourselves up to criticism if any aspects of some of these projects do not conform to these guidelines. And so, I have no problem saying 5 years for, low-density projects. I don't mind saying no incentive period to, kind of poorly designed projects that lack first-floor retail in most of the West End. I mean, we've already done that at the Standard and the some of the other projects over there. But if we have an opportunity to do, a building with, structured parking, first-floor retail on a commercial strip, that's going to have 4 or 6, 8 floors on it, I would hate to go ahead and say no to a developer like that, because, we can't go above 5 years and 75%. So I'm really concerned about that. And then the other one that I'm concerned about is up above, again, tying this back to the development costs. I kind of alluded to this a little earlier. One of the complaints that came up regarding the Foundry project was the total amount of subsidy. And of course, our local subsidy was based on the total development costs. I would feel, also acquisition costs. I mean, when we go ahead and use local incentives to cover acquisition costs, are the value of other subsidies, in my mind, that's almost like double counting. And I would prefer to actually have a higher percentage, that's me, that would be adjusted, that does not reward higher acquisition costs and does not reward subsidies from other, programs, with the idea that, what we're really doing, I mean, if there's one thing that is probably the central metric of everything we do is, are we creating value? In other words, what is the marketplace's reaction to, and of course the way we find that out, the truest way is when we go out to the bankers and we say, ignoring all of these subsidies over here, what will you as the banker give us for that? That's the value creation that occurs. And it's that delta that we should be thinking about, incentivizing. So, projects that use enormous amounts of subsidy but don't justify loans in the private market, then what we're doing is we're kind of double counting in my mind. And I'm throwing this at, you and I have talked about this a number of times, and I'm kind of throwing it at you here, but it's a concern of mine. We might not be able to address it in a resolution. Anything we don't address in the resolution on these bullet points, I thought we could go ahead and have kind of a comment section to provide additional guidance going forward of things that we are concerned about that might be addressed in subsequent versions of this, if that makes sense. That would be my comments on how we might address this. You know, the whole idea of acquisition costs and double counting on subsidies. My immediate concern, though, is on this resolution would be, you know, capping at 5 years and providing a better definition of exceptional. For example, let's say IKEA. Now, IKEA actually is in an industrial area, huge money generator. I mean, we're making lots of money on IKEA. If that was in a, you know, adjoining a Category A neighborhood or even a C neighborhood, you know, we would pass up on IKEA because we're using 5-year tax abatement. You know, it's just capped at 75. So we don't distinguish between employment opportunities, revenue opportunities, and residential. Does that make sense?
And like a destination, like that would be, I mean, that, to me, one of the things that we don't talk about is actually growing the pie. I think, you know, something that is catalytic and grows the pie, like an IKEA, a destination, I think wouldn't be necessarily the same role as you, right?
Well, even when you talk about residential housing, you can almost have the same scenario because you can't only build affordable housing in a city. A city cannot survive with only having affordable housing developed. So you want to develop market rate housing as well because you want people to move into your city to have some higher income levels so that they're spending more money on the tax base and improving your city for many different reasons. And so that's why you can't get pigeonholed into this scenario of don't give anybody any incentives, don't, you know, only build affordable housing. I mean, it's just not realistic in building a city. And when we talk about this city, we got to remember that our infrastructure is in place where it housed 900,000 people or more. And so as we redevelop this city, we've got to create some developments that take up some of that and improve some of the infrastructure that we don't have money to improve. And so you got to look at every development different and evaluate it. And so some of it, I go back to it, some of it is going to need much higher incentives. And I don't want us to get stuck and people go online and look at our, and say, oh, well, no reason to go to St. Louis and keep going. We don't want to be in that position. We just don't.
Here's what I suggest that we do is I kind of made my comments on both those two things, the definition of exceptional project as well as the use of market value analysis. I think it's clear that we're going to have to reword these things. We will go ahead and reword those over the summer.
Okay.
And we will get this copies out to everybody and let you kind of tinker with them. But those were my two observations. Certainly, I am looking forward to comments on people's reaction to mine, or if they would like to contribute something else to how we might want to reword these things. Alderman, I just spoke. Are you comfortable with your comments at this point? Okay, Alderman Kotar.
Nothing further.
Okay. Alderman Ogilvy.
Thanks. So I think it's very important, regardless of what, you know, the exact language in the final draft of this, I do think it's very important that within the resolution we acknowledge that a higher level of incentive should be available in the most struggling markets, and a lower level of incentive should be available in the strongest markets. I think the MVA is probably the right tool for that because the MVA is an analysis of real estate strength, while the census is an analysis of incomes, and those are not always the same thing. And I do think Alderman Roddy alluded to this a little bit. I do think there also is a difference between, we may need to somehow break out the difference between single-family stuff, which I think in most cases, new single-family housing, a lot of it could already have a reduced incentive, even homes that are not in the strongest real estate markets, and larger construction. Or infill housing versus construction that is replacing industrial areas or something, which is going to have a lot more expense than just, single or scattered site infill. So we made it to differentiate that. But if we do this resolution and we don't reference at all the fact that single-family homes in strong markets shouldn't get 10-year tax abatement, we're making a big mistake, I think. For this to be a credible document about being more nuanced in how we do incentives, we need to make sure we are acknowledging, we are dialing that back for a lot of the single-family stuff. I'm already telling people this, builders in my ward, 5 years is the maximum, maybe 75%. So I need other aldermen, I need SLDC to be saying the same thing to people as well. I think we can, I think whatever the resolution says, we're gonna have to build in a little flexibility, but we definitely need recommendations 9 and 10 just to acknowledge, and we may not need specific percentages in here, but we need them to acknowledge that a higher subsidy is a possibility in weak markets, and a lower subsidy, we're going to put a cap on things in stronger markets. So that's my takeaway.
Are you guys making notes? I'm kind of making some notes on these comments myself, and I figured that, either you or I would kind of try to capture the essence of what's being said, and then can I rest assured that you guys will capture what's being said, and then you will circulate it among the committee sometime over the summer, and we'll try to get comments back and tweak it and do a lot of this stuff by email. Okay.
Be helpful, though, to have a copy of maybe your notes as well, so as we're doing.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to do the best I can, because I'm not the best note taker, but I have been scribbling a few here. Alderman Boyd stepped out for a bit. Alderman Bosley stepped out for a bit. Alderman Oldenburg.
No, I think that's good. I like the idea of defining exceptions and unexceptional cases, because often, sometimes within routine, exception becomes the norm, and I think that we want to make sure that we're in agreement on what we're defining as an exception, and that reasonable people would agree on that. So I think I'm good moving forward. Thank you.
Okay. And you were the last at that round. So now we have kind of what I would call kind of some collateral issues that I think we need to kind of begin seeking, and then we also have a couple issues that the deputy mayor wants to bring up with us to include as well. The first one is we had a lot of comments about equity lens. I know the mayor has I'm so bad with titles, but a new advisor that is on that. Have we shared our guideline? What I would hate to do is us pass this, have people say that we hadn't considered that. I'm an old white guy. It's probably not me to be the one trying to figure out what's the, what issues are most appropriate to address in an equity lens, but
That is something that we were considering, and you're thinking of Nicole Hudson, who is the deputy mayor for that area, and so we will be having that conversation with her.
Okay. Next item, and these are mine, so certainly, I'll give everybody else a chance to jump on here in a second. We have, I believe in some of our, and I get fuzzy on these things, we have established goals in employment and
Workforce.
Wage types of, living wage types of things. The resolution does not address that in any way, but it certainly does not diminish or undermine any of those things. I think that should probably be said in here as well, just to make sure that it's, we're telling the public that we are thinking about those things, but is there a role to address any of those issues in this
Well,
resolution? Or is
it
there
was
some
silent on
change?
it because we already have an ordinance that basically, we have two ordinances that essentially tells us to abide by a certain, so we can refer, it's no problem. In fact, we were intending to, we have the three areas. We have the financial analysis, the urban design, and the architectural. We can look again and see whether or not we'd like to say that, say 5% of this is through the equity lens, and 10% of this is looking at workforce, whatever. But we already do that. And so I just wanted to stick to I call them the three tough things that we were doing. I think maybe there might be in the preamble to all of this that, that we will, adhere to all of the
That's
city's-
what I'm looking for, yeah, that, that we are not losing those things in our discussion of these issues. The next issue is regarding kind of implementation of this, which keeps getting kicked further and further back, but there's two aspects of implementation. That is, projects that are currently in the pipeline that may have had some sort of anticipation of the way we used to do things before, and then when the agreement will go into effect, and creating a deadline for when we expect that either the citywide plan be done or that we adopt some new ones. My thought was that, this should probably, maybe not be an annual exercise, but probably a biannual exercise where we revisit these things from time to time as we get better data. When we come back, we are going to be, our alderman from the 16th has agreed to, I guess, assist me, or maybe it's a way of me going ahead and having him do work so I can take credit for his work, but he is going to begin interacting with the comptroller's office and the SLDC, and we're going to go ahead, and we've been toying around with some stuff to kind of measure performance on these things. How well are they actually, benefiting? Are we making money at IKEA? How much money and stuff? And all of our data is typically at a macro level right now. It's going to require us to get much more granular with that. And it's going to require the cooperation of multiple city departments, the comptrollers, the SLDC, probably the assessors, collectors, and so forth. So it's going to be kind of an interdepartmental effort that's going to be, believe me, is very slow and time consuming. But we'll be starting to develop those, and the idea is as we develop those, the stuff that we're doing, is it working? And if it is working, how is it working, or what's not working? And that might result in us revising and revisiting these policies. So my thought would be is that we need to kind of set a sunset on this so that it will either coincide with the citywide plan that is being developed, or something, a year or 18 months from now that would coordinate with, a review of some of the performance measures, hopefully, that we're establishing. So I think we need to have the period of agreement and any exceptions going in that should probably be listed as an attachment, with as much specific guidance as we can provide at this time on those things. And then the last thing is I think we ought to provide some guidance on some regional approaches. The alderman from the 24th and I have disagreed several times on the floor regarding retail sales. I agree with his analysis. I just think that it's, lost opportunity for us. And the mayor now we have a new county executive. The mayor is engaging with things like, Better Together and groups like that. And now might be a good time for us to start trying to create some ground rules on a regional basis, what we should do there. And simultaneously or concurrently is I think we ought to start organizing an effort so that what's frustrating for me is that a city that is like the city of Clayton, and I'm not picking at the mayor of Clayton, used to be a business constituent of mine, so I don't want to go ahead and start creating an intra-regional bashing contest here, but if the city of Clayton, who has a disproportionate share of the region's wealth and a highly underrepresented share of the region's poor people, are providing incentives to further insulate themselves, while we have a disproportionate share of the region's poor people, and we are trying to compete with them, we ought to have some ground rules where the amount of incentives and how they're using the incentives aren't putting us in an inappropriate position. And I think that's a dialogue that, needs to be had at both the state level and at the regional level. And I think it's, I think now is a good time for the mayor, well, maybe not if they're in negotiations, but, not in a real assertive way, but in a, constructive, consensus-building way. So those are my kind of comments about what we, how we might want to go ahead and address some of this stuff. Some of those, I think that kind of collected my ideas. If somebody else would like to go ahead and respond to anything I said, or else add something where we can start giving guidance at going forward, I think now would be the appropriate time, and then we'll circle back and provide the deputy mayor. Alderwoman Davis, do you have any comments there?
I just think it's important for us to be careful and we move forward with federal guidelines and those ordinances that we have in place when we're talking about applying certain standards. The other thing, too, when we talk about the development projects, most especially those that I consider to be commercial, like when you refer to Clayton, like the Centene project, when you look at projects like that, what most people don't understand is the value that they bring to a city. For those who have not paid attention, Clayton downtown was almost dead. They had so much vacancy there, it was incredible. And so, yes, they needed to secure their tax base. So they made a level one decision to give that incentive to get all those employees there with all the payroll taxes and stuff coming in, even if they never leased out, all the empty space was there. So it was kind of a smart move, and sometimes you got to look at that. You take that big apple that's there, and maybe you don't deal with all the little small grapes, and you won't have as big of a headache. So I really want us to be able to balance all of that, and however we interpret this resolution, it gives us those opportunities to do that. We have so many ordinances already in place that guide us. We have so many federal rules that guide us. I heard somebody mention something about residential, and I thought about all the federal housing standards that have to be met. I mean, it's just too many things that we don't need to try to create something new, is what I'm saying. Don't get ourselves in jeopardy.
Thank you, Alderwoman. Alderman Kotar,
Nothing further.
Alderman Ogilvy,
No other comments.
Alderman Oldenburg.
No, we've covered a lot.
Okay, so we will go ahead, with regard, well, before we go ahead and wrap up the resolution, let's recognize the deputy mayor who had a couple insights into the resolution and
Alderwoman, I'm glad you brought up the concept of the value that's brought to the city of new projects. I think that it's, to me, the phrase I use is I don't want us to unilaterally disarm, and have somebody else, especially when I think about that Centene building that's going to have 250,000 square feet of new Class A space, and we have, employers downtown that are eyeing that. They want it. We want them to stay here. So we cannot unilaterally disarm. And the other point that I thought you made, and I don't know how we articulate it better, but I think, people think that we've got this pot of money that we're giving to developers. And it's really, how are we sharing the upside? And I wonder if we need to think about a different terminology of upside sharing as opposed to this is, a giveaway from the city, because it really isn't. It's how do we as a partner, public-private partnerships, share. The other one I want to talk about is transition, because it affects us here, and I want to talk a little bit again about the state, and I know that's not the subject here, but I'd love to think about how we as a city talk to the state, but grandfathering people in projects that are in the pipeline. A pipeline, somebody doesn't say, today I'm going to do a project tomorrow. We know that developers take, and especially in the city, because it is a complex set of subsidies and incentives, it could be a 2-year process. And so I'd like you to think about, and I think you've already, by bringing up the conversation and starting the conversations and having the public hearings and input, I think people know that there's a change coming, and I think, we're having conversations with people already without the presence of the resolution. But I think we need to be careful that there are projects that are in the pipeline right now that we could hurt even with these modest guidelines that we've got here. Think appropriate modest guidelines that we've got here. Modest isn't probably the right word, but I mean, I think it's a lot of things we're doing, but it's more carefully refined about which neighborhoods and how much, and the gradients of that. But there are people that are out there that have turned off the spigot and stopped their pre-development, and I'm worried about that at this point in time. So, I think.
Well, what would be, I guess, what would be your recommendation on how we deal with projects in the pipeline, timing, and so forth? So can you kind of give us some specific?
I haven't really talked specifically to developers, but I think, maybe a transition period that allows for other factors to be considered for up to maybe 8 to 12 months after the resolution's adopted. I don't know if that's the right timeline. Depends on when this gets passed, but I want to tell the development community not to turn off the spigot on pre-development expenditures because they don't know what might happen here due to uncertainty.
Well, I don't want to wait. I mean, we're
No.
losing 2 months already because
Okay.
we're out of session, so I don't want to be talking about 8 months after we pass this
Okay.
thing. I think we need to, maybe if nothing else, we can reach a consensus today on what our deputy mayor can tell people that this is going to be phased in. And then I think from a standpoint of accountability, if you have specific projects that are in the pipeline that you know about, we need to attach those, specifically to the resolution.
And we can work on a list of the ones that we know about. There are probably ones that aren't ready to go public yet, so we might need to have a,
That's where I'm at on 2 projects, and it's detriment to any project if we attach that project to this resolution, because then they are sitting out there as a target, and they're going to come after them, and then we might lose them altogether. And so I would be very, very, very careful about doing that. And I mean, and I'll give you a good example, and I'll try to keep it as without divulging too much. We've not had a lot of new building done in downtown, period, which is needed, okay? And I'm working on 2 projects, new construction. But I can see what's gonna come after these guys, and I'm trying to protect this project and make it what I think it will survive in our approval process. And so we've already been working on it 8 months, probably got another 4 or 5 months to go. And by the time it gets into this pipeline, it could be 6, 7 months from now. Do I kill it? Just tell them now?
No, well, my sense is, the guidelines that we're talking about aren't like I think they're a measured response to what's in the marketplace. I mean, there have been only a few projects that have used the bottom half of the TIFs. Out of all the things that we've done, there's only been a few. Now, the substitution effect is going to have a pretty substantial impact on retailing projects, I think. I think we've already been cutting back on incentives on the market value, on residential, low-density residential in I've always thought that we could do a better job in this stuff, but I don't think we were ever doing just a horrible job. You know, it's just a matter, a measure of refinement. And I'm, if we go ahead and we dilute this thing with too many exceptions, too long of implementation periods, I think we're going to lose our credibility. And I would ask that we try to make this as soon as possible, and the list of exceptions of projects in the pipeline is finite and as short as possible. And, developers know that this is coming already, I think, and I think we're only talking, for most of the projects, this is only gonna be, maybe
A tweak.
1% or
Yeah.
2% of project costs that we're talking about here.
Well, and as you both said, you have been talking to developers about it. Jonathan Ferry's been in place, and we've had that analysis. I've been talking to developers about it. So I think you're correct. The word is out there. We're being, being more refined about the thoughtfulness and the appropriateness of the levels involved. But I do bring up one issue on the state side that I want you to take into consideration. At this point in time, there's a large number of development projects in our city that have been turned down for brownfields, that they thought that in accordance with prior guidelines and analysis was a completely reasonable request for brownfields, which has created a gap that's not being filled by brownfields. I think we should push back at the state and say, again, if you're changing the guidelines and the rules, what they did was they turned off a light switch. And we need, and so I like to say to them, and I think this is, because of the time and thoughtfulness and the hearings that you've had, we've had a transition period. I'd like to give the state the same kind of message. We need a thoughtful transition period because, there are developers that have turned off the spigot and have left our community, is what I understand. I'm taking it all second and third hand, but I take it on good authority, not as much because of the city, it's because of the state, and I just want to be thoughtful and
Or
cautious.
tax credits as well.
Exactly, but the current projects are, so if they, if they put into place the recommendations for the commission, I would hope that we have a thoughtful transition period at the state level. But it seems like with the extended conversation we've had over the last 3 or 4 months, I think we've had a chance to do some of that here locally.
Well, again, to try to go from the abstract to the succinct or specific, what would be your preferred implementation period, and how are we can convey or identify projects that you feel are in the pipeline that have advanced planning and have done advanced work that may require an exception to this?
I don't know, you probably know more about the projects in your own neighborhoods than I would know in some cases, but maybe the end of the year, 6 more months? I don't know what.
So
And with some,
effective January 1, I don't feel like any of these things are, that we're proposing today, with the exception of the 5-year 75% that would not impact any of the homes, but that could have a dramatic impact on a dense development that, if it were to occur. Other than that, I have nothing, that I feel that these things are so radical that, it's going to upset the apple cart so much that projects are going to go away. Now, that's when I say in the pipe, stuff that we've already passed, obviously, that's done with, but I'm talking about stuff that, hasn't had legislation introduced.
So if you pass it in October, which is probably likely, we come back, we have a few weeks to get it passed and stuff. We'll probably pass about the first week in October, and got a couple of months left in the year.
So January 1 are you comfortable with that? Alderman 24, I'm getting shrugs, yes, from down at this end. Okay, so we're getting yes on that. Okay, and then how do you want to convey I mean, projects that would you anticipate being in the pipeline after January 1, or in the pipeline now, but we will not have had legislation on prior to January 1?
I'd like to come back and make some recommendations. It could be they have an option contract on the purchase property that is in existence at the time, or, something else that's objective and measurable so that you know that they've incurred some expenses, pre-development expenses, and have acted in reliance on the prior, understanding. You're right, I think we've been pushing this direction, but I don't know what an objective test, I think giving a list of names might be, as the Alderwoman has said, damaging to those projects, because especially if they have a targeted tenant that is going to be, identified by merely identifying what the project is.
I think what we'd be looking for is projects that are somehow or another date stamped. Maybe it's if it's confidential, interdepartmental emails with date stamps on them that identify the project, so that if you're worried about sharing it with the general public, you at least can go ahead and show. But I would want to have a specific number or something to that effect that, so that this thing, it doesn't just end up being, a big
Absolutely.
black box that nobody knows what's in it.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, appreciate it.
Okay. The last thing I want to show, and I swear this is the last thing, this is a tool that Otis and I have been talking about. He kind of came up with one version, which I will pass out. The other one is that spreadsheet that's already in front of you. And Alderman Ogilvy, this is going to be, my O's, Alderman Oldenburg, this is kind of going to be related to what you're doing. What I would like to do, you did permitted projects. What I was interested in doing was a end-of-year report. Mr. Executive Director, if I could borrow some of your staff, I'd like to, going forward, if I could share this with you. I gave you, Mr. Williams, a spreadsheet here. And what I thought was, this is in a way part of our new GASB requirements, I think, but it would be beginning to report them in a different way, so that at the end of the year, we could go ahead and do kind of year-to-year comparisons. And my hope would be is that we would get all of the development value that are done by project. So we'd identify it by ward, by neighborhood, the project name, and begin taking a look at this stuff. What was the use? Was it retail? Was it residential? Was it warehousing or so forth? The size of the project, the total project cost, and whether the project received incentive or not, we would still record it. And then the type of incentive, was it local incentive? Was it tax, abatement, TIF? And then based on our models, what was the value of that incentive? And then was there other incentives associated with it? Was it brownfield, so forth? Was there other value? What was the other values associated with those other incentives? And then the reason for the incentive, so we began thinking about, was it removing blight? Was it stabilizing neighborhoods? Was it, was it retail to create more revenue, so forth? So that was kind of my idea, is that we would begin doing something like that each year. We would have a report at the end of the year, and then the following year, we could take a look at it, and we could start measuring things like the amount of incentive relative to the total development, development value that's being created in the city, and we could start creating some metrics like that. So I think I've worn everyone out, but I would hope that we could get something like that done for us. Okay. Having, I think, worn everyone out, is there any other comments or anything, or can we adjourn? We no longer have a quorum, but
These two we're going to look at, okay.
move to adjourn. Second. It's been moved, and all those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming down today. Man, I am killing some